On the Throwback Thursday, we're seeing how school has changed over the years at 9.
And back to school season is here, but why is the first day of school such a big deal nowadays? Has it always been like that? I don't know, but he does. Celebrity historian Raffi Andonian will join us next with a history lesson about back to school. Tough to believe this, but it is time for the kids to head back to school. A lot of them have moved on already. So let's stop for a minute, though, and just think to ourselves, why is there so much hype around the first day of school? Has it always been that way? Well, I'm no historian, but I know a guy. In fact, here's the guy, celebrity historian Raffi Andonian, who is here on this Thursday morning to educate us as part of our Back to School series sponsored by St. Luke's Urgent Care. Always good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, and I came in appropriate attire. SLU, of course.
Beautiful.
Where I got my MBA.
Yes.
In Harris Stowe, where I teach, our local school. So, of course,
go
I had to
Hornets,
come
go
ready
Billikens.
for back to school.
So let's answer the question that we asked off the top. Has it always been this way with the hype videos and the taking pictures on the first day every single year?
No, it has not, for a couple of reasons, but I'll give you some numbers to help you kind of see how it was not a big deal. Why? A little more than a century ago, in the early 1900s, only about 14% of Americans aged 25 or higher had completed high school.
Oh,
and believe it or not, it didn't change that rapidly. So, for example, a little more than 50 years ago, in 1970, that number changes to about 55%. So think about it, just 50 years ago, still you had half of Americans that had not completed high school. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that you have 90+% of Americans that complete high school by age 25. Wow. So the difference of access to education and people getting educated changes how popular back to school is. Sure. In the early days, back to school meant a one-room schoolhouse that Kent referred to, for example, and actually in there the schoolmaster might get like monitors, which are like some of the best students to teach the newer students. Right. So there was kind of like a funny system. Or homeschooling was a big deal. Abraham Lincoln was largely homeschooled, for example, or apprenticing, which is like a large internship for the trade. So those are the kinds of things you had. But in the American Revolution, it does change some things locally in some places, and also the importance of educating women was a big deal because of the American Revolution, because women are seen as guarding the virtues of the Republic, and so that begins the process. And so eventually in the 19th century, you do start to have what we recognize as public schools start to pop up, but not really popular until the 20th century.
I have to think the advent of the public education system pushed us forward leaps and bounds.
That's right.
What can you tell us about public education in St. Louis?
Yeah, so public education, as we know, it starts in Massachusetts, but you know what? Forget them. Right. We started a lot of stuff right here in St. Louis. Of course, the first public kindergarten in the 1870s. And I would put that in the context of increasing public education. That started in Carondelet. Of course, you can still visit the school. The building is still there, Carondelet Historical Society. You can go check it out, which is pretty cool. And in fact, it was such a big deal that within 20 years or so, by the turn of the century, there were a lot of school teachers that were coming there to learn about this thing called kindergarten and how to teach kindergarten. So St. Louis was a big influencer in that regard. And it's no surprise because Susan Blow, who started the first public kindergarten, went to a guy named William Harris, actually the guy from Harris Stowe, captured in Harris Stowe. Yep. And Harris was the leader of the St. Louis public schools, and he had done quite a bit of innovations in education himself, won 5 grand prizes at an international expo in Paris in the year 1900 because of what they did at public schools here in St. Louis. So there's a lot of stuff going on here in that regard. So and if you want to talk about Stowe and Harris Stowe, now Harris Teachers College was a teachers college that started in honor of Harris himself. Stowe started out of a St. Louis public school system too as a teachers college for black teachers. Harris was for whites, Stowe was for blacks, and so both of those things eventually merge after integration. And funny enough, Harris Stowe today is in the old Vashon High School building. Beautiful architecture at Vashon High, beautiful architecture at Harris Stowe. St. Louis University, of course, beautiful architecture. Yeah. And the thing to note about the beautiful architecture is because the schools back in the day, because back to school was not a big deal, they were often in temporary buildings in random spaces. Right. But the big architecture comes into place because schools started to be more important as reading and writing became more important with industrialization.
I feel like the impetus behind all of this was there was a time in this country where you could be a functioning citizen with a full-time job without being able to read and write. That changed.
And I would put in just one more bigger context, which is the popularization of printed books becoming cheaper and more widely spread. So reading and vision became more in demand, whereas that wasn't the case centuries ago. So the printing press plays a role in that as well in a broader world history context. Right. And then within industrialization in the United States, as you point out, really makes it interesting. So those situations are what's pushing it. And St. Louis being at the hub of industrialization has a lot of influence across the country based on the things that we just talked about.
How about this guy always brings the goods. We always learn a lot when you stop by. We appreciate it. Happy back to school season.
That's right.
We'll post this segment after our show on firstalert4.com/great day, guys. How about that? All roads lead back to St. Louis.
I was just going to say
Of course they
that.
do.
I was just going to say that.
Yes.
Thanks, guys.